The Krathek's cubs huddled around the heating element in the cargo bay, their obsidian scales catching the dim light as they attempted what their human crewmate called cooking. Ambassador Marcus Webb watched from the doorway, his weathered face creasing into a gentle smile as the three young predators struggled with ingredients that seemed to have a will of their own. Zixra, the eldest at barely 7 cycles, held a protein cube between her claws like it might explode. Her amber eyes narrowed in concentration as she tried to remember the human demonstration from earlier. Next to her, her brother Kralix poked at a heating coil with the curiosity of someone who had never seen fire used for anything other than destruction. The youngest, Vesisa, clutched a container of what humans called spices with both sets of arms, her head crest flaring with nervous excitement. The Kratheks were apex predators on their homeworld, designed by evolution to hunt, kill, and consume raw flesh, with efficiency that made Earth's big cats look like domestic pets. Their jaws could crush bone, their reflexes could track prey through dense jungle at night, and their natural venom could drop a full-grown Thorian in seconds. But none of that mattered when facing the mysterious art of human food preparation. Marcus had been assigned to their ship as a cultural liaison, part of humanity's effort to build bridges with species that most of the galaxy feared. The Kratheks were powerful, territorial, and had a reputation for solving disputes with their claws. But Marcus had learned something important during his months aboard their vessel. These cubs, orphaned by the wars that had ravaged their species, were just children trying to understand a universe that suddenly seemed much larger than their jungle homeworld. "The humans said we must apply heat to transform the food," Zixra announced, her voice carrying the subtle hiss that marked her species' speech. She placed the protein cube on the heating element with exaggerated care. "This will make it better." "Better how?" Kralix asked, tilting his head in a way that made him look less like a fearsome predator and more like a confused puppy. "Our food is already dead. What more does it need?" "Flavor," Vesisa said, repeating the word Marcus had taught them like it was a sacred incantation. She unscrewed the spice container and poured a generous amount onto the protein cube. Then she poured more, and more. The red powder formed a small mountain that completely buried the food beneath. Marcus winced but said nothing. This was their learning experience, and he had promised himself he would let them figure it out on their own, even if the result was going to be catastrophically inedible. The heating element did its work with ruthless efficiency. Smoke began to rise from the protein cube almost immediately. The spices, whatever they were, created a smell that made Marcus's eyes water from across the room. The cubs watched in fascination as the food changed color from pale gray to brown to black to something that looked like it belonged in a geology exhibit rather than on a plate. "It is transforming," Zixra observed with scientific interest. "The surface has changed its molecular structure." "It is also making much smoke," Kralix added, waving a clawed hand in front of his face. His secondary eyelids slid closed to protect his eyes from the growing haze. Vesisa leaned closer, her crest flattening against her skull in concern. Should it be that color? The human's food was not that color. The protein cube had now achieved a shade of black that seemed to absorb light. Flames licked around its edges, and the spices had fused into a crust that looked like volcanic rock. The heating element itself was struggling, making small beeping sounds that suggested it was not designed for this level of culinary abuse. "I think it is ready," Zixra announced with more confidence than the situation warranted. She used a metal tool to lift the cremated protein cube off the heat, leaving behind a scorch mark that would probably never come clean. The food itself cracked ominously as she transferred it to a standard-issue plate. The three cubs stared at their creation with expressions that Marcus couldn't quite read. Pride, horror, confusion. Probably all three mixed together. They had followed the human instructions as they understood them. They had applied heat. They had added spices. They had transformed the raw into the cooked. That this transformation had gone several steps beyond what anyone would consider edible was beside the point. "We should present it to the human," Kralik said suddenly. "He teaches us his ways. We should share what we have learned." Marcus's heart sank even as it swelled with affection. They wanted to share their accomplishment with him. These young predators, capable of tearing through steel doors and calculating hyperspace jumps in their heads, wanted to show him what they had made. It would have been the cutest thing he had ever seen, if not for the fact that he was probably going to have to eat it. Zixra picked up the plate with both hands, holding it like a sacred offering. The three cubs walked toward him in single file, their claws clicking on the metal deck. Their faces showed such earnest hope that Marcus felt something break inside his chest. He had eaten some questionable things during his years as an ambassador. Fermented Vrelian root that tasted like battery acid, live squillix that tried to crawl back up his throat, ceremonial Drenthian paste that had been aged for 600 years and tasted like it. But none of those compared to the emotional weight of this moment. "Ambassador Webb," Zixra said formally, her young voice trying for the diplomatic tones she had heard adults use. "We have prepared human food. We would be honored if you would consume it." Marcus stepped forward and took the plate. Up close, the protein cube looked even worse than from a distance. The spices had carbonized into a shell that made the whole thing look like a meteorite. Smoke still rose from cracks in the surface. He was fairly certain that the center was still on fire. "Thank you," he said, keeping his voice steady. "This is very kind of you." The cubs watched him with laser focus, their predatory instincts making them track every movement of his hands. Marcus realized that his human social training and their hunting patterns were creating an audience of maximum intensity. Three pairs of amber eyes fixed on him with the kind of attention their ancestors had used to bring down megafauna. He broke off a piece of the protein cube. The exterior shattered like obsidian, revealing an interior that was somehow both raw and burned at the same time. Physics apparently worked differently when cubs were cooking. The smell hit him next, a combination of charred protein and whatever spices Vesasa had dumped on in quantities meant for a military battalion. Marcus put the piece in his mouth. His taste buds immediately filed for asylum. The spices, concentrated and burned, created a flavor that his brain couldn't quite classify as food. It was bitter, somehow sweet, extremely salty, and carried an aftertaste that suggested the heating element might have contributed metal shavings to the recipe. The texture was wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Parts crunched, other parts were rubbery. Some sections seemed to have achieved a state of matter not previously known to science. He chewed carefully, aware that the cubs were analyzing his every expression. Their crests were raised in anticipation, their tails still with tension. In their eyes, Marcus saw something that made him keep chewing despite his body's protests. They weren't just watching to see if he liked their food. They were watching to see if he was safe with them, if this human would reject their offering, if they had somehow failed again at connecting with the species that seemed to connect with everyone. Marcus swallowed. It took effort. "It's very interesting," he said, which was the most honest thing he could say. "Tell me about your process." The cubs exploded into explanation, all three talking over each other about heat levels and spice ratios, and how Kralix had wanted to add engine coolant because it was blue, and some human foods were blue, but Zixra had said that was probably wrong. Marcus listened and nodded and took another bite, and another. With each piece he consumed, the cubs grew more animated. Zixra's crest flushed with color that indicated pride in Krathek's body language. Kralix actually bounced on his back legs, a behavior Marcus had never seen in a species known for their predatory grace. Vesasa moved closer, her young face showing emotions that her species usually kept hidden behind hunting masks. Marcus worked his way through the protein cube with the determination of a man defusing a bomb. Each bite was a challenge. His stomach sent increasingly urgent messages that he diplomatically ignored. Sweat formed on his forehead, though whether from the spices or the effort of not showing his distress he couldn't say. But he kept eating because these children had made something for him. And in that gesture was everything humans had been trying to teach the galaxy about themselves. Humans were not the strongest species. They were not the fastest or the smartest or the most technologically advanced. But they had one trait that set them apart and somehow let them survive in a galaxy full of beings that should have eaten them generations ago. Humans could find common ground anywhere. They could sit at any table, break bread with any species, and find the threads that connected them all. Sometimes that meant eating burned protein cubes that violated multiple laws of thermodynamics. "This is delicious," Marcus lied, taking the last bite. His definition of delicious had become very flexible over the years. "You all did an excellent job." The cubs practically glowed. Zixra's tail swished in the pattern that meant joy. Kralix made a chittering sound that was the Krathek's equivalent of laughter. Vesisa reached out with one small clawed hand and very gently touched Marcus's arm, a gesture of trust that nearly made him tear up despite the war his digestive system was currently waging. "We will make more food tomorrow," Zixra announced. "We will practice until we are skilled." Marcus's smile didn't waver even as his soul quietly screamed, "I look forward to it." Over the following weeks, the cubs cooked for him regularly. Each meal was a new adventure in culinary disaster. They boiled things that should be fried things that should be boiled, and developed their own category of preparation that Marcus privately called punished by physics. They mixed sweet and savory with the abandon of scientists testing chemical reactions. They discovered that heating elements could reach temperatures that made metal glow and decided those were the correct temperatures for everything. Marcus ate it all. Word spread through the ship. The Krathek's crew, apex predators who viewed most species as either threats or food, watched the human ambassador consume meal after meal prepared by untrained cubs. They saw him smile through tears brought on by spice levels that could strip paint. They watched him compliment presentations that looked like crime scenes. They observed him return night after night to eat food that their own species, with digestive systems designed to handle raw meat and bone, wouldn't touch. The cubs thrived. They began experimenting with human recipes they found in the database, though their interpretations were creative. They learned about seasoning ratios, though they thought the human recommendations were merely suggestions to be improved upon. They discovered that not everything should be cooked at maximum heat, though they still believed most things should. Their skills improved slowly, moving from biohazard to merely challenging. Captain Thexerel, the ship's commander and the Cubs' guardian, approached Marcus one evening after a particularly difficult meal. The protein synthesis had somehow achieved both liquid and solid states simultaneously, defying thermodynamics in ways that would interest scientists and horrify chefs. "Ambassador," the captain said, her deep voice rumbling with something humans had learned to recognize as emotion in Krathex. "I must understand. Why do you consume their failed preparations? Your species has poison responses. I have seen your medical file. You should reject this food." Marcus looked at the captain, this being who could tear him apart without effort, but was trying to understand a human behavior that puzzled her. "Because they made it for me," he said simply. "Because they're trying to connect across the space between our species. Because every burned bite tells them that humans don't give up on them." Thexeral's crest flattened in the gesture that meant deep thought. "This is why the galaxy fears and respects your kind. You should not survive. You are small and weak and your emotions control your logic. But you persist. You find worth in failure. You see potential in those others reject. We see people," Marcus corrected gently. Just people, trying their best. The captain was silent for a long moment. Then she made a sound humans had learned was Krathek's laughter. The Cubs have asked permission to prepare a meal for the entire crew. I had planned to refuse, but I think now we will accept, and we will all eat what they create, as you do. The meal was exactly as catastrophic as Marcus expected. The Cubs prepared enough food for the 40-member crew, scaling up their recipes with mathematical precision and absolutely no additional wisdom. The cargo bay was transformed into a dining area. The heating elements glowed, the smoke alarms were disabled. And the Cubs cooked with the focused intensity of their predatory heritage applied to the art of human cuisine. The results were spectacular in the worst way possible. But as Marcus looked around the room at Krathek's warriors, forcing down burned protein cubes and overspiced vegetable matter, as he watched them compliment the Cubs with the same diplomatic skill he had shown, as he saw this species of apex predators choose kindness over honesty, he realized something important. Humans weren't changing the galaxy by being strong or smart. They were changing it by showing that strength could be gentle, that predators could choose compassion, and that the most important ingredient in any meal was the intention behind it. The Cubs had learned to cook, but the crew had learned something more valuable. They had learned to see with human eyes, where burned offerings could be acts of love, and every terrible meal was a bridge being built one painful bite at a time. Marcus took another piece of protein cube, this one somehow both frozen and burning. He smiled at Vesisa, who watched him with hope in her amber eyes. And he ate every bite, just as he always did, just as he always would, because that's what humans did. They showed up, they persisted, and they found connection in the most unlikely places, even if it meant eating food that violated the Geneva Convention. Later, in the privacy of his quarters, Marcus took medication for his protesting stomach and updated his report to Earth Command. He wrote about cultural bridges and diplomatic victories and the slowly building trust between humans and Kratheks. But what he didn't write, what he kept in his heart, was simpler. 3 young predators had learned that not everything in the universe was about hunting and survival. Sometimes it was about creation, about sharing, about the simple act of making something for someone you cared about. Even if that something was burned, overspiced, and possibly sentient, it mattered because of the hands that made it and the heart behind the gesture. That was the lesson the Cubs had learned. But it was also the lesson they had taught. And Marcus would keep eating their terrible, wonderful food for as long as they kept making it, because that's what family did. And somehow in this cargo bay full of apex predators and diplomatic disasters, that's exactly what they had become, Ad.